Okay, I want you to imagine something with me for a moment. Just picture this. You're a teenager, exactly 18 years old.
Hmm.
And it's 6 o'clock in the morning, the sun is barely up, the corridors of the palace are cold, and you are fast asleep.
Right.
Suddenly, your mother wakes you up. She's frantic, urgent, telling you that you have to get out of bed immediately. You're confused, groggy. You put on a simple dressing gown, walk into your sitting room, still half asleep.
And you're not expecting visitors at this hour.
Not at all. And there, standing in the room, are two very important, very serious men, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain.
Wow. That is a terrifying way to wake up. To see the highest religious figure and a top official just standing in your living room before dawn.
It is. And they bow, lower than they've ever bowed to you before. And they tell you that your uncle, the king, has died during the night.
And that one sentence changes everything.
Everything. It means you, an 18-year-old girl who has lived this incredibly sheltered, lonely life, are now the most powerful person in the richest country on earth. You are the queen.
It's an incredible amount of pressure. I mean, most 18-year-olds are worrying about exams or parties.
Exactly.
It's not about running a global empire.
Could you handle that? Could you step out of your bedroom and onto the world stage in just a few minutes? Because the woman we're discussing today did exactly that. She took that pressure, she held it for 63 years, and she changed the world forever.
She absolutely did.
Yeah.
We're talking about a figure who really defined an entire century. Her name literally became an adjective for an era.
Welcome to Hello English.
It's wonderful to be here.
I'm your host, and I'm the one who gets to ask all the questions and get excited about the stories behind the history.
And I'm here to help analyze those stories, look at the language, and, connect the dots for you.
Today, our mission is a special one. We're going to explore the life of Queen Victoria. And we want to focus on clear storytelling, some essential English vocabulary, and helping you really understand what we mean when we say the Victorian era.
Right. This isn't just a dry history lesson. It's a look at how one person can shape the language and the culture that we still, in many ways, live with today.
It is a fascinating period. And to keep us all on track, we have a clear roadmap. There are 3 main goals for you in this deep dive. First, we're going to learn the human story. The story of the girl who became a global icon.
Second, we're going to master some key vocabulary words, but naturally as they come up in conversation. Words you'll hear a lot, like reign, empire, monarch, devoted, mourning, industrial, and legacy.
We won't just define them, we're going to see them in action.
Exactly. And third, we're going to do a little bit of English grammar practice. Specifically, we'll be looking at how we tell stories using the past simple tense and how we use time expressions to talk about these long periods of history.
Absolutely, because when you talk about history, you have to be comfortable with the past. So let's unpack this. Let's start right at the beginning with the girl before the crown.
Let's do it.
So Victoria, I think when we picture her, we usually see this, older, serious woman in black, a bit grumpy looking.
Famous statues.
Yes. But obviously she started as a baby. She was born in 1819 at Kensington Palace.
That's right, May 24th, 1819. Her father was Prince Edward, the Duke of Kent. But here's the first real tragedy of her life, and it really sets the stage for everything that follows.
What's that?
Her father died when she was less than a year old.
Wow. So she grew up without a father figure from the very start.
She did, and her childhood. Well, it was not a happy fairy tale. We have this idea of princesses living charmed lives. But Victoria later described her childhood as rather melancholy.
Melancholy. That's a great word. It's more than just sad, isn't it? It implies this sort of long-lasting, deep gloominess.
It's a state of being, exactly. And a big reason for that sadness was the environment she was raised in. It was dominated by something called the Kensington system.
The Kensington system, that sounds like, I don't know, a new diet or an exercise plan?
It does, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
But it was far from anything healthy. It was a really strict, I would even say abusive, set of rules created by her mother, the Duchess of Kent, and a man named Sir John Conroy.
And who was he?
He was her mother's advisor, but really he was the puppet master. A very ambitious, controlling man who saw Victoria not as a child, but as his ticket to power.
So what did the system actually look like day to day for a young Victoria?
It was designed for total control. She was under constant supervision. She was isolated from other children. She wasn't allowed to see anyone her mother and Conroy didn't approve of, which included most of the royal family.
She was essentially under house arrest in a palace.
That's a very good way to put it.
Yeah.
And I read this one detail that I think just perfectly paints the picture of how intense it was.
Go on.
She had to share a bedroom with her mother every single night.
No.
Every night. Until the day she became queen.
I can't even imagine. As a teenager, having zero privacy like that.
None. She slept in her mother's room. Her playtime was spent mostly with her dolls. She had over 130 of them. And her little dog, a spaniel named Dash. Dash was probably her closest friend.
It sounds incredibly lonely. Why would they do that? I mean, why treat a future queen like a prisoner?
It was a power struggle, a classic one. You have to remember, the king, her uncle William IV, was old. He didn't have any legitimate children. Everyone knew Victoria was next in line.
So this was all about what would happen when she took the throne.
Exactly. The goal of the Kensington system was to make her weak, to make her feel so dependent and unsure of herself that when she became queen, she'd be too scared to rule alone.
Ah, so she'd have to rely on them.
They wanted to be the power behind the throne. They were hoping for a regency where they would rule in her name. They bullied her. They tried to force her to sign documents that would give them power after her.
So they were actively trying to break her spirit.
They were. But here's the fascinating part. It backfired.
How so?
Instead of making her weak, it made her incredibly strong-willed. It made her stubborn. She learned how to keep secrets, how to hide her true feelings. It was a brutal education, but it taught her how to survive.
The pressure created a diamond. I love that. So let's fast forward to that morning we imagine. June 20th, 1837. Her uncle dies.
Yes. He had famously said he wanted to live just long enough for Victoria to turn 18, specifically so her mother couldn't be regent. And he made it. He died just a month after her birthday.
That is an impressive level of spite, holding on to life just to thwart your sister-in-law.
It is, isn't it? So Victoria is woken up. She walks into that room. She's told she is the queen. And because she is 18, she is legally an adult.
No regent needed.
No regent needed. Her mother and Conroy had lost.
And her very first act of independence. This is my favorite detail of the whole story. It's such a small thing, but it means so much.
I think I know what you're going to say.
On that very first day, just hours after finding out she was queen, she ordered her bed to be moved out of her mother's room.
Yes. It's symbolic, but it's also so practical. It's basically saying, the old rules are over, I'm in charge now. It was the first time in her life she had ever slept alone in a room.
What a statement. Such a boss move. And she didn't stop there, did she?
No, she saw the Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, alone. And she completely banished Sir John Conroy from her presence, cut him out of her life entirely.
The victim became the master in a single morning.
It was a total reversal of power. Now, before we get into her rule, this is a great moment to pause and look at our first major vocabulary word.
Okay.
We keep saying she became the monarch.
Right, let's spell that. M-O-N-A-R-C-H. Monarch.
So a monarch is a very specific type of ruler. It's a gender-neutral word for a king, a queen, an emperor, a head of state, who usually inherits their position.
So it's different from a president who is elected.
Exactly. Victoria was a powerful monarch. Queen Elizabeth II was a monarch. King Charles is a monarch.
Got it. And the second word that goes hand in hand with that is reign.
Yes, and this one is tricky because of the spelling. It's R-E-I-G-N.
R-E-I-G-N, but it sounds exactly like the weather. Rain, R-A-I-N.
A homophone. Same sound, different spelling, different meaning. Your reign is the period of time you rule as a monarch. It refers to the duration of your power.
So you can use it as a noun, like her reign was very long.
Correct. Or as a verb, she reigned for 63 years.
Okay, that brings us to our grammar spot. We're telling stories about the past, so we're using the past simple tense. Let me try using that word. She become queen at 18.
Ah, so close. That's a really common mistake for learners. But become is the present tense form.
Right.
The past tense of become is irregular. It doesn't just add in a D.
It's not becomed, it is became. She became queen at 18.
Perfect. She became queen. And we've used a bunch of other irregular verbs already. She woke up, she said something, she was told she had a dog.
English is full of them. You just have to learn them, right?
Unfortunately, yes. But listening to stories like this, hearing them in context over and over again, is honestly the best way. She became queen. It just starts to sound right.
Okay, let's move on to the next chapter of her life. So we've got this young queen. She's finally independent. She's kicked her mom out of her room.
Metaphorically, anyway.
Right. And she's enjoying her freedom. She loves dancing, parties, staying up late. But there was a problem, wasn't there?
The problem was that in the 19th century, a young, unmarried female monarch was seen as a bit unstable. Everyone in government, everyone in the country wanted her to get married,
They wanted a king to sort of guide her?
to guide her and provide an heir. But she wasn't keen on the idea at first, was she? She was enjoying being her own boss.
She said she dreaded the thought of marrying. She didn't want to give up her power to a husband. But then
Then she saw her cousin again.
enter Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. And yes, for anyone wondering, he was her first cousin.
Very common for European royalty at the time. It was all about political alliances and keeping the royal bloodlines, well, pure, as they saw it.
So they'd met before, but this time was different.
It was. He visited her in 1839, and Victoria was just completely smitten. It wasn't just a political match for her. She fell deeply in love.
She wrote about it in her diary, right?
Oh, extensively.
Mhm.
And her diaries are amazing because we get her own unfiltered thoughts. She wrote about his beautiful nose, his exquisite mouth. She was head over heels.
But there was a bit of a social snag. He couldn't propose to her.
No. Protocol dictated that because she was the reigning monarch, she outranked him. No one could propose to the queen. The queen had to choose her own husband.
So she had to be the one to pop the question.
She did. On October 15th, 1839, she called him into her private room and proposed to him.
I love that. It's so modern, in a way, a woman taking charge of her romantic destiny.
It really is. So they married in 1840, and their relationship was, well, it was the defining relationship of her life.
Was he just a prince consort, a nice-looking guy on her arm?
Not at all. And this is what's so interesting. Albert was incredibly intelligent, very serious, very hardworking. He was arguably much better educated for the role of a ruler than Victoria was.
Because of her isolated childhood.
Exactly. He became her chief advisor, her private secretary. He taught her how to be a modern constitutional monarch, how to manage the paperwork, how to deal with politicians. It was a true partnership.
Not always a smooth one, I hear.
No. Victoria had a terrible temper. She would have these furious outbursts. Albert was much calmer and more logical. Apparently, he would sometimes leave the room during one of her tantrums and slide notes for her under the door to continue the argument more calmly.
That's amazing. But despite the fights, they were deeply in love.
Absolutely. Which brings us to our next vocabulary word, devoted.
Devoted. That's a really powerful word. It's much more than just loving, isn't it?
It is. It means completely loyal, loving, and dedicated. There's a sense of deep commitment to it. You could say Victoria was devoted to Albert, or they were a devoted couple.
It implies that their lives were completely intertwined.
And they were. Their desks were side by side. They worked together on state papers. Everything they did together.
And they were certainly devoted to building a family, 9 children.
9 children, yes, between 1840 and 1857. It's an incredible number.
I mean, can you imagine running a global empire, dealing with parliament, and you're pregnant or recovering from childbirth almost constantly for 17 years?
It's mind-boggling. And to be honest, Victoria herself didn't really enjoy the process. She wrote in her diary that she thought newborn babies were ugly, like frogs.
She did not.
She did, and she hated being pregnant. She felt it robbed her of her dignity as a queen, but she was devoted to Albert, and a large, happy family was central to the image they wanted to project to the nation.
This image of the perfect, moral, middle-class family, but on a royal scale.
Exactly. And because they had so many children who all had to marry other royals, Victoria picked up a famous nickname.
The grandmother of Europe.
That's the one. It sounds very cozy, doesn't it?
It does, but it was a massive geopolitical strategy.
It was. Her 9 children and her many grandchildren married into almost every major royal family in Europe. We're talking Germany, Russia, Spain, Greece, Sweden, Norway.
It's like the ultimate family networking event. Her grandson was the Kaiser of Germany. Her granddaughter was the Tsarina of Russia.
The idea, which was mostly Albert's, was that if all the rulers of Europe were cousins, they wouldn't go to war with each other. You don't declare war on family, right?
A nice idea in theory. How did that work out in practice?
Well, fast forward to 1914, and World War I was essentially a catastrophic family feud between Victoria's grandchildren, so not so well.
Right. So it didn't quite work out. And there was a darker side to that genetic legacy too, wasn't there?
Yes, the so-called royal disease.
Hemophilia.
What is that exactly? It's a genetic disorder where your blood doesn't clot properly. A small cut can be very dangerous. Victoria was a carrier of the gene, and she passed it down through her descendants.
And that had huge consequences, especially in Russia.
Huge. It was passed to the heir of the Russian throne, Alexei, through his mother, Victoria's granddaughter. His illness and the desperate search for a cure led the family to the mystic Rasputin, which helped destabilize the monarchy right before the revolution. A tiny gene, with massive historical consequences.
Wow. Okay, so let's zoom out a little. We have the queen, her devoted husband, the huge family, but outside the palace walls, the world was changing at an incredible speed. This is where we get into the Victorian era.
Yes, this is crucial. When we say Victorian, we're not just talking about the person. We're talking about a period of absolute radical transformation, maybe the biggest period of change in human history up to that point.
Let's put that in perspective. When Victoria took the throne in 1837, how did people get around?
On a horse, or in a carriage pulled by a horse, or they walked. Britain was still largely an agricultural society. Most people lived in the countryside.
And when she died in 1901,
The world was unrecognizable. People were driving the first cars, they were riding the London Underground, using telephones, watching early movies. The streets were being lit by electricity. The pace of life had just completely accelerated.
and a lot of that change was driven by the Industrial Revolution.
Which brings us neatly to our next vocabulary word, industrial.
Industrial, so that's all about factories, machines, mass production.
Exactly. During Victoria's reign, Britain transformed from a rural society based on farming to an urban industrial one.
Rural meaning the countryside, urban meaning the city. That must have been a massive shift in how people lived.
It was chaotic. Millions of people moved from the countryside into cities like London, Manchester, Liverpool to work in these new factories. The cities exploded in size. They became smoky, crowded, often unsanitary places.
But also places of incredible innovation and wealth creation.
The two went hand in hand. And Victoria herself was not some old-fashioned queen who was afraid of technology. She embraced it.
She was the first monarch to ride a train, right?
She was in 1842. And that was a huge deal. A lot of people were genuinely scared of trains. They thought the human body might not be able to withstand the incredible speed of, say, 20 miles per hour.
20 miles per hour.
But the queen did it, so it must be safe. She essentially endorsed the new technology for the whole nation.
She was an influencer before the word existed.
In many ways, yes. She was also the first monarch to be photographed extensively. Photography was invented during her reign, and she loved it. That's why we have such a clear visual record of her, from a young woman to an old lady.
And she used anesthetic during childbirth.
She did. Chloroform. That was highly controversial. Some religious figures argue that the pain of childbirth was God's will.
And Victoria said,
Basically, no thank you.
uh,
She used it for her last two children. And by doing so, she made pain relief in childbirth acceptable for millions of other women.
a true influencer. Now, we can't talk about this era without talking about the empire. This is a big, heavy topic.
It is. And it's our fifth vocabulary word, empire. An empire is a group of countries or territories all ruled by a single central authority.
And the British Empire was big.
That's putting it mildly. It was vast, the largest empire in history. By the end of her reign, Victoria ruled over 400 million people outside of Britain,
400 million.
about a quarter of the world's population at the time. Canada, Australia, India, huge parts of Africa.
That's where the saying comes from, right? The sun never sets on the British Empire.
Exactly. It was both a metaphor for its power and a literal fact. The empire was so geographically spread out that it was always daylight somewhere within its borders.
And she even got a new title to reflect that.
She did. In 1876, her favorite prime minister, Benjamin Disraeli, had her proclaimed Empress of India.
So she was Queen of the United Kingdom and Empress of India.
Correct. It was a hugely symbolic title, putting her on the same level as the emperors of Russia or Germany. Interestingly, she never actually visited India.
Never.
No. But she was fascinated by it. Later in life, she had Indian servants learn some Urdu from her teacher, Abdul Karim. She developed a real affection for the culture, even if she never saw the place itself.
We have to acknowledge the cost of that empire, though. It wasn't just about drawing lines on a map.
Absolutely not. And this is the complex part of her legacy. The empire was built on conquest, exploitation, and often brutal suppression. While it brought immense wealth to Britain, it often came at a great cost to the colonized peoples.
It's important to hold both of those truths at the same time.
It is. From Victoria's perspective, she saw it as a civilizing mission. She likely believed she was a benevolent mother figure to the empire. The reality on the ground was often very, very different.
A complex legacy, for sure. Okay, let's do a quick language check-in. We're talking about a very long period of time, 63 years. This is where those time expressions are so important.
Yes. Prepositions like for, during, and from, dato, can be tricky. Let's clarify.
Okay, can I say she reigned during 63 years?
It sounds a little unnatural. When you have a specific duration, a length of time you can count, we use for. She reigned for 63 years.
Okay, so 4 is for the number. For 10 minutes, for 3 days, for 63 years. What about during?
We use during to say something happened inside a named period or event. It gives the context. The Industrial Revolution happened during her reign, or she loved photography during the 1850s.
I see. So 4 tells you how long, during tells you when. And from dot to.
That's for the start and end points. She was queen from 1837 to 1901.
That's a great rule of thumb. For length, during the event, and from to for the start and end.
Get those 3 right, and your historical storytelling will sound much more natural.
Okay, we are moving into the next phase of her life now, and the tone here changes completely. We go from the happy family and the growing empire to deep personal tragedy.
Yes, the year 1861 is the absolute turning point in Victoria's life. If her life were a play, this is the tragic end of Act 2.
What happened?
Prince Albert died. He was diagnosed with typhoid fever. He passed away on December 14th, 1861.
He was so young.
Only 42 years old. Victoria was completely and utterly shattered. He wasn't just her husband. He was her best friend, her chief advisor, the center of her universe.
Her entire support system was gone.
In an instant. And she blamed her eldest son, didn't she?
She did. The Prince of Wales, Bertie, who would become Edward VII, was a bit of a playboy.
Just a bit. He'd been involved in a scandal with an actress, and Albert, who was already feeling unwell, had traveled in the cold to confront him about it.
And Victoria believed that trip, that stress, is what killed him.
She did. She wrote that she could never look at her son again without a shudder. She never truly forgave him.
That is just so heavy. This brings us to our next key word, mourning.
Mourning.
Yep.
M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G. It's the expression of deep sorrow after someone has died. And in the Victorian era, mourning was a very public, very ritualized process.
There were strict rules about it.
Oh, incredibly strict. What clothes to wear, for how long, who you could see. There's a whole social code.
And Victoria took this to an absolute extreme.
She wore black for the rest of her life.
For how long?
For 40 years. From 1861 until her death in 1901, she never wore color in public again.
40 years? That's more than just a statement. That's a way of life.
Was. And she didn't just wear black. She withdrew. She disappeared from public life. She hid herself away in her castles, Windsor, Balmoral in Scotland. She became a recluse.
And people started calling her the Widow of Windsor.
Yes. And at first, the public was very sympathetic. Of course, they felt for her. But after a few years, the mood started to change.
People got tired of it.
They got annoyed. They felt they were paying for a monarchy, but they didn't have a monarch. They wanted to see her, opening hospitals, attending ceremonies. But the palaces were empty.
There was that famous incident with the sign on Buckingham Palace, wasn't there?
There was. Someone stuck a sign on the railings that said, "These commanding premises to be let or sold in consequence of the late occupant's declining business."
Ouch, a for sale sign on the palace. That is some peak British sarcasm right there.
It was a real low point for the monarchy. Republicanism, the idea of getting rid of the royals altogether, actually became quite popular for a time.
But someone helped her through this deep grief. A certain Scottish servant enters the picture.
Ah, John Brown, yes. He was a gillie, an outdoor servant at her Scottish castle, Balmoral. Albert had known him and liked him. And after Albert's death, Brown became Victoria's personal attendant.
And their relationship was close.
Very close.
Yeah.
Uncomfortably close. For many in the royal court. He was blunt, he was informal, he didn't treat her with the usual deference. He ordered her around a bit, told her to get out and get some fresh air.
And she needed that.
She seemed to love it. After being surrounded by people bowing and scraping, he treated her like a human being. But the rumors started to fly.
People called her Mrs. Brown.
They did. Her own children were horrified. They hated him. But there's no doubt he helped her. He got her out on her pony again. He made her laugh. He brought her back to life, in a way.
It's fascinating how she always seemed to need a strong male figure in her life. First Conroy, who she resisted, then her Prime Minister, Melbourne, then Albert, and then John Brown.
It's a real paradox, isn't it? The most powerful woman in the world who relied so heavily on the support of these men.
So she's unpopular, she's in hiding. How did she turn it all around? Because she didn't die an unpopular recluse. She died a global icon.
Which brings us to the final chapter, the survivor and the legacy. And ironically, one of the things that made her popular again was that people kept trying to kill her.
Wait, what? Assassination attempts made her popular?
In a strange way, yes. There were at least 7 documented attempts on her life during her reign.
7? That's incredible.
It is. They started early in her reign and continued right into the 1880s. Mostly they were lone individuals, often with mental health issues. They would take shots at her carriage with pistols.
Did they ever hit her?
They usually missed, or the guns were faulty. But one man ran up to her carriage and hit her over the head with a cane.
He hit the queen with a cane.
He did. It left a nasty bruise. But here's the key thing. Victoria was incredibly brave. Her reaction was never to hide. After an attempt, she would make a point of driving out in her carriage again the very next day.
To show she wasn't afraid.
Exactly. And the public adored her for it. It reminded them that this little old lady in black was tough as nails. She was a survivor. Every time it happened, there would be this huge wave of public sympathy and loyalty that just drowned out the Republican voices.
So her bravery brought her back into the public's affection. And then came the big celebrations.
The Jubilees. First, the Golden Jubilee in 1887 for 50 years on the throne, and then the Diamond Jubilee in 1897 for 60 years.
These were huge global events, right?
They were massive. Processions, parties, kings and princes from all over the world coming to London to pay homage. By this point, she wasn't just a queen. She'd become a symbol.
The mother of the nation.
The benevolent matriarch of the empire. She represented stability and tradition in a world that was changing frighteningly fast. She had been on the throne for so long, most people couldn't remember a time without her.
She died in 1901. And she had a very specific and I think very moving request for her funeral.
She did. After 40 years of wearing nothing but black, of demanding black drapes and black everything,
Yeah.
she requested a white funeral.
White. Why white?
She wanted to be buried in her white wedding dress and her wedding veil. Her view was that her death wasn't an end. It was her reunion with Albert. She was going to meet him again as a bride, not as a widow.
That's surprisingly romantic and touching.
It is. She wore black for the world, but white for him. She was buried beside him at Frogmore near Windsor Castle, not in Westminster Abbey with all the other monarchs. She just wanted to be with her husband.
And she was succeeded by her son, Bertie, who became King Edward VII. So let's talk about our final vocabulary word, legacy.
Legacy. What a person leaves behind, what they are remembered for, the impact they have on history.
And Victoria's legacy is just immense. Where do you even start?
Well, politically, her legacy is the modern British monarchy. She oversaw the shift from a monarch with real political power to a constitutional monarch who reigns but does not rule. She has influence, but Parliament has the power. That model is why the monarchy survived when so many others in Europe collapsed.
And culturally.
The whole concept of Victorian values, that emphasis on family, duty, morality, earnestness, even things we take for granted, like the tradition of a bride wearing a white dress, that was popularized by Victoria's wedding.
Really?
Before her, brides just wore their best dress, whatever color it was. She wore white, and suddenly every bride wanted to wear white.
And geographically, of course.
Her name is everywhere. Victoria Falls in Africa, Lake Victoria, the state of Victoria in Australia, cities named Victoria all over the world. Her stamp is literally on the map.
It's a legacy of resilience, duty, and defining the identity of a nation for a century.
Absolutely.
So we have covered the story, the words, the grammar. Let's do a really quick recap just to make sure all of this sticks.
Good idea.
We talked about monarch and reign.
The ruler, and the time they rule for.
Devoted and mourning.
Deep love and deep grief, the two emotional poles of her life.
Industrial and empire.
The changing world around her, factories at home, colonies abroad.
And finally, legacy.
What she left behind for all of us. And don't forget that grammar tip. Use for when you're counting the time, like for 63 years. And use when you're placing an action inside a period, like during the Victorian era.
Small words, big difference. Now, we have a question for you, the listener. We want you to think about this. If you were a monarch for 63 years, what would your legacy be?
That's a great question.
Would people remember you for your laws, your style, your family? What would be the one thing people said about your reign?
It makes you think about what we all leave behind, even without a crown. What's our personal legacy?
Exactly. At the end of the day, Victoria's story is really a story about resilience, isn't it?
I think so. She started as this lonely, controlled girl playing with her dolls. She faced assassins, she lost the love of her life, she endured public criticism, and she just kept going. She showed up and did the work for over 6 decades.
It shows that even if you start small or you feel overwhelmed by the pressure, you can achieve incredible things.
Persistence is everything.
Well, that brings us to the end of this deep dive into the extraordinary life of Queen Victoria.
It's been quite a journey through the 19th century.
If you enjoyed this story and want to learn more about the world she lived in, you should definitely click on our channel. We have a great video about the Industrial Revolution that explains all those new technologies we mentioned.
And another one on the British royal family tree, which untangles how all those European cousins were related.
There is always more to learn. Keep watching, keep learning, and we'll see you in the next deep dive.
Goodbye, everyone.